In a recent MSNBC interview, political commentator James Carville had this to say about January 6th and a Fox News audience.
What does it tell you that even for the Fox audience, forget the rest of the country, even for the Fox audience, the truth wasn't going to work? The truth that Donald Trump and these other officials and other people that were documented with the January 6th committee and elsewhere led this thing. That didn't work. They couldn't stick to the truth. So as you say, they had to actually start blaming other people for what we all know was a Trump rally that turned into a Trump insurrection.
They were desperate to have an answer. It was bad optics of people beating up policemen and breaking into windows, all right? And their audience desperately needed another explanation. And if they were going to keep their audience, they had to supply. The Antifa thing fell apart, so Mr. Epps was to remain the man. And that audience, they just can't let it go. They have to, it's a giant monster that you have to feed every night.
I mean, Jess, you're talking about a third of the country. I mean, is James, and I know James personally, but is he right?
Yeah, I think he's right there. I think it is a monster you have to feed every night. I think that goes for most cable news. However, Fox is a bit of a different beast. I think when it came to January 6th, they did not want to believe that these were people who they wanted to believe it was outside infiltrators. They wanted to believe it was Antifa. They didn't run coverage oftentimes of the January 6th committee hearing on Fox News. They did not want the truth when it came to this. Now, is that a decision Fox made deliberately? Is this a kind of reverse causality thing where you can blame the viewer for not wanting it, not wanting to be ready for it, or you can blame the making production decisions at Fox for not covering it?
I mean, Jess, look, I just did a quick Google search here. Just quick Google search. You got to love technology. A poll that came out just a couple months ago. A little more than half of Republicans do not approve of what happened at the Capitol on January 6th. And so while I respect James, I think he's talking about a very small, marginalized percent of Republican conservative-leaning individuals in the country, because clearly the vast majority say, hey, we don't like what we saw. That wasn't okay. That wasn't acceptable behavior. Yet, I think it's the appearance that, which I don't really like, that a lot of outlets make it appear that it's all Republicans who approved of what happened January 6th. All conservatives approved and advocated and supported what happened January 6th. And that just simply isn't the case.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think Fox News is a news network that's going to make decisions based on how, the typical voting Republican or registered Republican is voting. They make decisions about what performs well with their audience. And so if they run some programming on January 6th that's factual and it's not performing very well and they're seeing viewers drop off, that's what they're making decisions on. And so Fox has no obligation to cater towards Republicans as a party or as an audience. If they're seeing their viewers don't want January 6th content, I can see them just deciding, all right, we're not going to cover the January 6th committee hearing. We are going to run programming of commentators casting doubt on the realities of the situation and saying it was Antifa infiltrators at the Trump rally. That's a decision Fox News could make. I can also see executives at Fox intentionally wanting to sow a narrative of what went down on January 6th being outside infiltrators and not wanting to air live coverage and commentary of the January 6th hearings. I can see that absolutely being the case. Sometimes we saw, the January 6th hearings on Fox News with the volume so absurdly low that people would intentionally turn off the channel or change the channel, but they wanted to say they were being non-biased by running coverage of it. I think there's a lot of games that go on. Are they making decisions for their viewers, or are they making decisions based off of what they want their viewers to believe? I think it goes both ways with a news network like Fox.
I mean, look, I think when you look at this cross-tabulation of this poll that's mentioned in a Washington Post article that came out last year, and this is where it gets really fascinating here, Jess. So a little more than half of Republicans disagree with the violence, but half think the actual protests were legitimate. And I think if you're a Fox News executive and you're looking at surveys like this, then you're thinking to yourself, okay, while a huge percent of our viewers didn't like the violent aspect of it, that same percent believes that it was indeed legitimate for individuals to be there protesting. And so I think if you recognize that, then they are going to some effect want to placate to where that audience is. Now, how far you go, I think is up for debate. But it is clear that at least some Republicans say, hey, if Americans want to protest something peacefully, they can. And when you cross the line of violence, then that's where you see a lot of people saying, wait a minute, that's a bridge too far. And I think from Fox's perspective, they're looking at this data, trying to figure out, well, where do we as a news outlet go in terms of telling this story? How much do we report on this? And what version of the narrative, if you will, do we report to our viewers? But on the flip side, yes, I do understand the critique of saying, well, don't you have an obligation to tell the complete story and allow your audience to arrive to some conclusion on their own? But then my counter to that would be, do any network you follow that script of really sort of being completely objective in terms of how they report on certain stories? Or if there's a story they like, they report on it from their perspective. And if there's a story they dislike, they over-report on it. And so maybe Fox went too far, but I don't think they're doing anything different or unique from what other outlets do to a lesser extent.
I think they're absolutely doing something different and unique, and I think that's why they exclusively had to pay out nearly $1 billion because they were spreading election lies following 2020. No other network had to do that. And so Fox certainly, following the 2020 election, did have coverage that was a bit different from other networks in that sense. And it brings us back to what journalistic integrity is, right? Do they have a duty to cover the largest committee hearing we're having in Congress? Maybe that's debatable. Maybe they'll say you can turn on C-SPAN if you want to watch that. We're going to cover something else. But they explicitly aired posts echoing lies about what happened in the 2020 election, making it seem like there was fraud, making it seem like Dominion was complicit with that election fraud. And so it was dangerous programming that I think sows some mistrust in our democratic process when we already have a problem with democracy in this country. And so I don't think that was helpful. And I don't think that that was good reporting on Fox's part. And I don't think it was a good decision for the executives to allow their host to unchecked say those things. And when it comes to January 6th, they also spread misinformation when it came to their reporting on the insurrection, what a lot of their opinion journalists were saying. And so I would say they're unique in that. We don't see any other networks paying out nearly $1 billion because of misinformation they spread on their network.
No, that's fair. And I think that goes to my point of saying, well, maybe they went a little too far. But I think Fox, Jess, will probably agree that although they haven't necessarily publicly acknowledged this, they did settle. And we know a settlement, for the most part, you kind of acknowledge some level of guilt in something, or you're just trying to completely get rid of something because you don't want to deal with it. In this particular case, I think Fox looked at the results, looked at the case and said, you know what, it's better for us to settle with $700+ million than to potentially go to court, and this gets a lot worse than what we expected. But Jess, I have another perspective I want to throw in here. What responsibility, and maybe this ties into what we discussed earlier about education, what responsibility do we have as individuals to have more discernment, if you will, in the information that we watch, that we read, that's being fed to us, or is the obligation solely on the outlets?
I think it's a good question. I think Carville made a good point in that it's a beast that you have to feed. At some point, you tune into Fox News, maybe you like it, maybe you think it's trustworthy, maybe you didn't get a super high quality of education in America's fine public schools, and maybe you don't have that, right? What obligation do we have as a nation to provide quality education so people can make that decision for themselves and not rely on corporations to be responsible in what information they feed people? I think when people have a taste for that kind of flagrant and sometimes hateful reporting, and they want more of it, I think James Carville was fair in calling this a beast that needs to be fed. What responsibility do people have to have discernment about what they consume? I would say you do have a responsibility. But when you talk about a media company that's the size of Fox News and they're covering an attempted insurrection, I think the responsibility falls on them to give some accurate reporting and maybe shift that polling so that people realize this was a violent insurrection and was undemocratic. And if you want to live in a democratic country, you probably don't actually support what happened on January 6th.
Yeah, I think the road ahead for Fox, Jess, is going to be really, really tough. And as I said, I think outlets, generally speaking, tell stories from a perspective that benefits them when they like that particular story and overcover stories they dislike. But I would agree with you in terms of how far you go in that regard really makes a difference between paying nearly $1 billion, Jess, and not paying nearly $1 billion. And in that regard, I think you're right. More Rising right after this.